You may ask, why am I making a video about a Glock that's recently been taken completely out of production, was released first 27 years ago, and whose latest iterations can't even be sold on the market directly to the peasantry in California? Well, firstly, it's my YouTube channel and I'll do what I want. And secondly, there are so many out there that they'll be on the secondhand market for at least the next century. Well, here it is, my favorite pistol, the Gen 3 Glock 19. This particular example had about 7,000 rounds through it before I stopped keeping track of my round counts back in 2018. Seeing what I'd spent on ammo got a little terrifying. I've owned, carried, and been shooting it since 2013. At the time, getting a carry permit outside certain more conservative counties was really only possible if you had political connections or the sheriff was taking bribes. Santa Clara County. So, being able to carry in California is more of a recent thing. Thankfully, these days, it's usually a fairly straightforward, if unnecessarily expensive and onerous process to get a carry permit. You'll still run into counties that are run by people who generally dislike firearms and don't see a societal benefit to an armed citizenry throwing up roadblocks, but it is still possible to get a permit thanks to recent court rulings. Before we go too much farther, I just want to briefly explain the Glock ban in California. Starting January 1st, licensed firearms dealers in California will no longer be allowed to sell, offer for sale, transfer, or deliver any semi-automatic machine gun convertible pistol. What they mean is any Glock or Glock derivative like the Shadow Systems pistols with a cruciform-style trigger bar that can take the Glock auto switch, which is already a federal felony to possess because that device is a machine gun. Those won't be legal for sale other than through private party transfer. The Glocks, not the machine guns. So you won't be able to buy a Glock in a store, but you could buy one from your buddy and do the paperwork at your FFL and do the transfer that way. As usual, law enforcement is exempt from this law. But back to the Glock 19. Specifically the Gen 3, which until recently was the only generation of Glock handgun we could buy over the counter in California. Now we can buy none of them, well after the first. And if you can find one in stock anywhere. The shelves are pretty barren. The Glock 19 Gen 3 was introduced in 1998 and added these finger grooves that some people love and some people hate. I like them. I must have the exact average Austrian size hand of the designer, so, your mileage may vary. It added the thumb reliefs on either side. Also this accessory rail where you can clip on a light, laser, a bayonet if you wanted to. It's kind of silly. And also some minor internal upgrades. Also, since it predates the more obnoxious requirements of the California handgun roster, it does not have a magazine disconnect or loaded chamber indicator. These features are silly, but the California handgun roster is the subject for another video. Then, this guy proceeded to remain in production until this year, 2025. The general consensus is that the Gen 3 Glocks only remained in production for so long because of the California handgun roster make it the only generation of Glock that we could buy. And despite what people think, California is a pretty big market for firearms. I also suspect it lasted so long because of other military contracts around the world that specifically approved that model and just didn't want to go through procurement processes again. Now, before we get too sad about not being able to purchase new Glock handguns in California, remember that there are conservatively at least 1 million of them in California alone, and they are still legal to purchase on the secondhand market. And since firearms properly taken care of essentially last forever, they're going to be on that market for a long time to come. Now, in the immediate future, I would urge anyone in the market for a handgun to not run out and pay inflated prices for a secondhand Glock, just because it's effectively banned from sale and discontinued. They're not rare, and there are still good modern striker-fired handguns on the roster. The eagle-eyed among you might notice that this Gen 3 looks a little different now. That's because Glock recently released a Gen 3 OEM slide with front and rear slide serrations, their proprietary MOS optics cut, and a complete set of installed parts for the model 19, 17, and 34. The 19 is the compact, 17 is the full size, 34 is the long slide. All you have to do is buy one of these slide assemblies, drop in your barrel and recoil spring, and you're off to the races. Installing an optic's pretty easy too. You just pick the MOS adapter plate that has the mounting footprint for your favorite red dot, then Loctite and torque the screws to spec, and it's done. I opted to use an Aftermarket Forward Controls RMR plate because it's a tighter fit around the optic and removes the need to use a sealing plate under the battery compartment on the RMR to keep it waterproof. Some people like to dog on the factory MOS plates, but I've seen plenty of them used successfully. Is it as rugged as the forward controls plate I used? No, probably not. Is it totally fine for most people? Probably. I also installed some taller aftermarket sights, so if the optic goes down for whatever reason, you can still shoot with your iron sights because you can see them through the optic. For anybody wondering about the nitty-gritty, here's the exact components I used for this. It's a standard Gen 3 OEM Glock, Magpul carry mag well, the meme tape, if you know you know, Vickers enhanced magazine release, standard Glock slide catch, the Glock OEM MOS slide, Dawson MOS height sights, forward controls RMR plate, and the Type 2 Trijicon RMR. Are there other aftermarket slide options that are optics ready? Sure. This slide's made by Faxon and comes optics ready with an RMR cut. But I found that some of these are occasionally not as reliable as factory options. Not dogging on Faxon, this one's been great, but I have seen many aftermarket slides that do not run 100% reliably. Mostly though, I like keeping the Glock aesthetic without having to have my slide professionally machined for one particular optic. Having your slide machined professionally, though, to accept a particular red dot footprint is probably the most solid way of mounting an optic. But if you're in California, you may or may not be able to put that on your carry permit depending on your county. It also locks you into that one mounting footprint forever unless you replace the slide or want to use an adapter plate, at which point you might as well have gotten the modular system anyway. The modular system does future-proof you a little bit because if your favorite red dot is ever discontinued or the industry moves to a new footprint, well, you can buy that dot, swap the plate, and put the whole thing on, and you're back in business. Now, on to the shootability. I'm not going to throw the gun at a ransom rest and show the mechanical accuracy of this gun, because plenty of people have done that already. With random ball ammo, these will generally print around 3 to a little over 4-inch groups. With premium defensive ammo, they'll generally shoot a hair over 2 inches. Personally, offhand at 25 yards, I can make what we would call effective shots on a standard B-27 targets without compromising on speed too much. And it gets easier the closer you get. Slowing it down and shooting for accuracy, I can usually keep it under a 6-inch group at 25 yards. This is all with the factory trigger and bulk ball ammo, mind you. Here's some targets from my last trip to the range. This was just standing and shooting 2 5-round strings, one at 7 yards and one at 25 yards, slow fire to demonstrate what a mostly stock Glock can do in terms of accuracy. I was shooting 115 grain MagTech ball ammo and the red dot zeroed for 25 yards. This is going to be pretty much the same as the rest of the polymer striker-fired handguns on the market. If you want something with an absolute accuracy guarantee of less than an inch at 25 yards, you're going to be looking at stuff like Olympic target pistols, custom 1911 shooting match ammo, or maybe the HK Mark 23, if we could buy those here. The fact of the matter is that accuracy doesn't matter as much as people think it does for a defensive handgun. Now, depending on the style of competition shooting you're into, that 3 to 4 inches of potential variance might matter to you. But a good, practical handgun should balance reliability and accuracy. There's often a price paid in all-around reliability for that razor-edge performance of more competition-focused guns. Also, to clarify, when I say competition, I mean that long-range bullseye stuff. For rerunning gun type stuff, tons of people shoot Glocks. It's a fantastic option. Speaking of reliability, well, it's a Glock. Enough said. I can count the number of malfunctions I've had with this pistol or observed with this pistol on less than one hand. The first was when I was teaching my mom to shoot it, and she was letting the pistol rock back under recoil, which caused a stovepipe jam. I explained what was happening, and she didn't have any more issues. This is something that can happen to new shooters using lighter weight guns, and ammo that's loaded on the lighter side like some 115 grain stuff, and isn't really a knock on the Glock. The second was with some very lightly loaded 115 grain Fiocchi, which would barely cycle my Glock 19 unless you grip the bejesus out of it. The ammo ran fine to my 17, but the ejection was very weak and the rounds just sort of dribbled out of the ejection port. I put it down to a bad batch of ammo since I'd shot tons of the same stuff before and it had run fine. The third was some Swiss Gecko brand ammo, which I haven't really seen since, that had some particularly hard primers. Maybe 10 rounds out of the case of 1,000 failed to detonate on the first strike. It was pretty obviously not a gun problem, but it stuck in my head because it totally botched in limited round count stage at an IDPA match for me. The fourth most recent malfunction was a failure to feed that happened to me during a handgun course. This was easily cleared with a quick mag change. The problem ended up being a bad magazine, where from the factory, some plastic flashing left over from the manufacturer of the magazine had gotten behind the metal liner at the top rear of the magazine. This forced part of that metal internal liner out a little bit, which would occasionally snag the rim of the next cartridge and cause an improper presentation of the next round. I was sitting up like this and tried to ram into the chamber sideways. I was able to reproduce this issue and since managed to fix that magazine. I'm not willing to get irked at Glock since they make millions of those magazines, and this was the first one I've ever seen that had that issue out of the package, and mags are a wear item anyway. Malfunctions happen, and it's often nothing to do with the gun at all. With most reputable handguns, the only issue you might have will be ammo or magazine related, and you can mitigate this by testing your gear at the range. Though if you're having a ton of malfunctions just on the flat range, something might be wrong with your gun. You should figure that out. People like to forget when they're shooting at the target range and just, oh, I cleared the malfunction, my gun's totally reliable, and you'll watch someone have their gun jam on them 3 times in a box. That's not normal. Now, that's not to say these are the only issues I've ever experienced with Glock handguns. These are just the only issues I've had with Glocks that weren't related to aftermarket parts. I'd hold up an example, but I don't have any now. This brings me to Glock's greatest blessing and maybe a little bit of a curse: the aftermarket. With Glock being one of the most popular brands of handguns in the United States, for its relatively low cost combined with reliability and accuracy, it naturally has a huge aftermarket of holsters and parts. As someone who has dabbled in making tricked out Glocks before, I can say with some authority that there is no faster way to ruin a Glock handgun than to install a bunch of neat looking aftermarket parts. That's not to say that they're all bad. Some aftermarket triggers like the Timney Alpha can be exceptional. Are they as reliable as a factory Glock trigger? Based on what I've seen, no. Are they unreliable with proper maintenance and an understanding of how they work? Also no. Would I run it in my carry gun? No. Would I run it in a competition gun? Sure. In fact, I may actually get around to doing that soon. For barrels, brands like KKM make super accurate match barrels with tighter match chambers for better accuracy, and some of those models are set up to run a compensator. Another cool aftermarket barrel and compensator is the Radian Ramjet. These can be awesome, but if you want to run a compensator, you have to remember that you're screwing with the balance of the system and shrinking those margins of error. The weight of your optic might cause issues. A compensator might mean you have to reduce spring weights or shoot different ammo. Reduce spring rates might cause issues with feeding, and so on. Remember, test your gear before you bring it to a match or try and carry it. One very common issue I have seen and personally experienced is with aftermarket slide stops. With modern high shooting grips, it's not unheard of for the palm of your hand to press up against the extended slide stops and engage them when you don't want to. I'll show you what that looks like. Right here, when you're gripping like this, sometimes you can push up that little lever right there. And if you're doing that, it might lock it back mid-magazine. Not ideal. This is why I exclusively use the flush-fitting factory slide stop that is shielded behind a small plastic protrusion here on the side of the gun. Even the OEM extended slide stop can do this, so it isn't exclusively an aftermarket part thing. I won't get into all the aftermarket parts out there floating around for Glocks because there are way more than I could cover in one video. I would just say, think of your use case for the gun first, be cautious with what you add, and if you plan to use it in a defensive handgun, I would always err on the side of reliability. And, obviously test it. Now, while the Gen 3 Glock 19 is my personal ride or die, my thoughts generally reflect my experience with the whole range of Glock handguns that I've shot, Gen 3 through 5. If you couldn't tell from everything till now, I sort of like them. So for all you lucky souls who can just go out and buy a brand new Glock, even if the new V series is somewhat controversial, it's definitely still a good choice. And for my California people, the Gen 3 Glock 19 is still a great option for a nightstand gun, carry gun, competition people, or even as a duty pistol, though it does sort of look a little silly with a full-size light on there. Well, unless you throw a comp on there and make a rollin' special, those will always look cool. But these guns are going to be around for years to come on the used market. And if you already have one, great, enjoy. Who knows? Glock might actually make a California-specific model, but I'm not holding my breath. Also, since law enforcement is still exempt from the ban, I suspect we will see new ones trickle onto the market. I'm not a lawyer, but it sounds like getting a Glock through an out-of-state intrafamilial transfer won't work anymore with the Glock ban. If you find a legal avenue, please let me know in the comments. But till the Glock ban and the roster go away, I'll be exploring some other options. Maybe a Walther PDP if I can wrangle one. Anyway, thanks for listening, and if you found what I had to say helpful or amusing, please like, share, and subscribe. I've been the 2A Tactical Dad, and as I like to say, we could all be a little more free and a lot more self-reliant. All it takes is a little responsibility. Also, fingers crossed the Glock ban goes away. And the roster, the mag ban, assault weapons ban, the 11% tax on guns and ammo, the state background check fee on top of the NICS background check, onerous requirements on California FFLs that drive up prices and run smaller gun stores out of business, the new tool and parts regulations that are so onerous to comply with that it will prevent most smaller niche vendors from dealing with California, and really all the other asinine things that we have to put up with in California that make being a legal gun owner difficult. Hey, Supreme Court, would sure be rad if you took a 2A case. Just saying, Clarence, can't be fun watching the 9th mock Bruin and Heller.